It's another day where we have this amazing turn of events where the U.S. bishops haven't let the fight go, and they're not going to, about their federal funding. And we're going to call it their federal funding because, in many ways, we for years have been decrying the turning of the Catholic Church into a glorified NGO. Well, it turns out that it wasn't a glorified NGO, it was just an NGO. When we're talking about the billions of dollars they've received, as people dig into these numbers more deeply, we find that the very existence, it seems, of the Catholic Church as we know it, as an institution in the United States, was so reliant on Uncle Sam that the loss of that federal funding, not just from USAID, but as we dig into these things, you start seeing this stuff coming from other places. The loss of that funding is an existential threat to the U.S. bishops, or that's how they perceive it. And we'll talk about that in a moment, but let's get our update on the health of Pope Francis, because this is probably the most important story going on in the church. And so I want to give you a daily update until things go back to normal or until we have a conclave, one of the others, since those are basically the options. The short version of the update comes from Michael Haynes, LifeSite News reporter. Now, most of these were published around noon or 1 o'clock Central Time yesterday, maybe with a quip from them in the evening, but evening in Rome is, lunchtime in the United States. So Michael Haynes is a LifeSite News reporter who says, February 20th evening update, Pope Francis' condition is improving slightly. That's the second day in a row it's been described that way. Says the Holy See press office in a rather brief update. He has no fever and, quote, his hemodynamic parameters remain stable. Today he received communion, then, quote, went about his daily business. We're not sure what his daily business is in the context of being in a hospital receiving care. We go to katholisch.de, the official news arm of the German bishops, where they gave on the same day in the afternoon in German time with the headline, Pope apparently stable, condition complex but not critical. He's been receiving treatment at Gemelli Clinic in Rome for almost a week. He's got a complicated respiratory infection, but his condition seems to be stabilizing. He got out of bed for breakfast today, and he is joking as usual. If he's able to get out of bed to receive his breakfast, that is a sign of recovery happening. Also, then another update, yesterday I reported that the Swiss Guard were rehearsing for a papal funeral. They have vociferously denied that that's true. So, again, there are people out there who are willing to make up news for whatever reason, and when it comes to church affairs especially, may God have mercy on them for such things. Now, that is a major update. Now, Chesty Marine gave me some news that I was not aware of. Federal judge slapped the USCCB lawsuit down yesterday. That's good news. I am quite pleased to see that. The USCCB, I will give you this as we go into this story today. The U.S. bishops may not be aware of this, but Catholics are a generous people. We've had our trust in our bishops broken over decades upon decades of constant changes in the church, them telling us, well, the church teaching, it says one thing, but in practice we must do another on all sorts of hot button moral issues. And always the do another means do what the world wants and not what God wants for some reason. We've had our trust broken for the McCarrick problem, those wicked men who are in the priesthood who should never have been allowed into the priesthood, typically men with a James Martin type inclination. Those men who cause grave immoral harm to seminarians and oftentimes very young men, we'll say boys. Catch my meaning? And the misuse of finances. Sometimes bishops living lavish lifestyles, priests leading double lives, all those things for year upon year upon year, to the point where many leave the faith or others refuse to give directly to the church anymore, choosing instead to sponsor a good seminarian that they vetted. So they help him cover his seminary costs, or they give to a feed the poor mission directly, or they give to a convent directly, or whatever it is. They still do their Catholic duty to support the church, but they won't support their parishes anymore. And with that, the USCCB has forgotten that most fundamental truth. And I will tell you how you can restore that trust. Catholics are a generous people, and Americans are a generous people. Look at how much we help other countries. So you put that together, American Catholics should be extremely generous people. But for that generosity to be shown again, for these programs that you say are so critical, as you're about to see, then you need to regain that trust. And you're not going to regain that trust by coming down on the side of certain political interests, on co-opting the gospel to facilitate the exploitation of the poorest human beings, including the illicit moving of the most vulnerable, youngest human beings for some unspeakably evil purposes. And then to evoke asylum laws when you do it, knowing full well that 80% of those who claim such status are lying about it. That is a fact that almost no one disputes. But the defenders of the practice will never bring it up. To rebuild that trust, to get people to fund it directly, because charity is not something that can be co-opted through the tax system. It can't be, give this to us or you go to jail, as is what taxes are. It has to be done voluntarily. And really, when you read the gospel, yes, the church has always said you can, through charity, count by supporting organizations that do charitable work, because not everybody is always in a position to do it. But the implication when you read scripture is that a lot of our charity should be done by us directly. But if the bishop want to restore that faith, stop coming down on the side of evil, stop being allies to Caesar in everything, especially particular ideological bent of Caesar, and actually preach the actual gospel, preach the four last things, preach the Catholic faith, actually act like Catholic bishops. And you do that long enough, and Catholics will start giving money again. That's my preface, a long-winded preface. And I know I covered Cardinal Cupich yesterday, but they decided to publish this. Apologies for the mocking tones you're going to hear me reading much of this in. This is absurd, and it's an insult to anybody. This document is an insult to anybody who understands the real issues here. And he is harming those he is trying to help. Because the more they push back and demand their federal funding as if it's some religious liberty right, yeah, the U.S. bishops released a document a couple days ago saying this was a right to religious liberty to have tax dollars to support this. The more they do that, the more hostile they make normal, otherwise good people to those who might actually need the help. Those who have a real case for asylum when they come to the legal entry points. Those who might have a legitimate reason to be an economic migrant. They harm those who actually have a legitimate case for our help. Did you know now that for the first time in almost a century, Americans are becoming more and more hostile to letting anyone in, legally or otherwise? I would put that right at the feet of people like Cardinal Cupich, who demand access to your tax dollars as a matter of right. Here is what he has to say. Published 2 days ago on Chicago Catholic, the Archdiocesan website for the Archdiocese of Chicago, we get this headline. It could actually cause death. Yes, the defunding of the money could actually cause people to expire. This is diabolical, what they're doing here. Here's the cardinal in his words. Over the course of just a few weeks, the new administration suddenly halted foreign aid for 90 days, making dramatic cuts in funding and staff at the U.S. Agency for International Development. This has thrown the network of charities that administers our global humanitarian aid, including those funded by Catholics, into chaos. There is a human cost to acting so precipitously, which is partially why on February 13th, a federal judge ordered the administration to restore funding, given the, quote, likelihood of a successful claim that the executive's actions violate the Constitution and statutes of the United States. As you know, last night, a federal judge smacked down the U.S. bishop's lawsuit on this. While the government has the right and duty to ensure taxpayer funds are spent wisely, freezing that aid even before any such review adds to the suffering of people who are starving, homeless, and threatened with disease. While the government announced that life saving aid work would be exempt, these exemptions are not being effectively implemented. A crippled USAID is not making timely payments for past and current work in these life saving programs, perhaps causing permanent damage to the ability of humanitarian aid groups to save lives. This is one of the reasons the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops filed suit against the administration on February 18th and lost literally 2 days later. The conference suddenly finds itself unable to sustain its work to care for the thousands of refugees who are welcomed into our country and assigned to the care of the USCCB by the government after being granted legal status, explained USCCB President Archbishop Timothy Broglio. The USCCB, which, quote, spends more on refugee resettlement each year than it receives in funding from the federal government. Again, if you've been following my coverage of this, that's a carefully worded phrase because funds are fungible. If you go pull up any of those grant flow charts, looking at the U.S. grant website or the Data Republican tracker on these things, you will find that these organizations get money from one NGO who gives it to another, who gives it to another, who gives it to another. And the USCCB is one such NGO. They receive money from multiple sources for this. But notice they always say it receives in funding from the federal government, meaning funding directly. But they get it from other sources, which usually have their point of origin from the federal government or very questionable billionaires internationally who have publicly stated that they want to essentially flood civilization with hordes of barbarians. They've admitted as much, and so they give this, and that makes these organizations complicit in it. According to the lawsuit, we are still waiting for reimbursements from the government totaling about $13 million for expenses prior to January 24th, which you're not going to get because you lost that lawsuit. The decision to abruptly slash USAID funding brought swift responses from the international community, including the Holy See. Quote, stopping USAID will jeopardize essential services for hundreds of millions of people, undermine decades of progress in humanitarian and development assistance, destabilize regions that rely on this critical support, and condemn millions to dehumanizing poverty or even expiration, according to a statement from Caritas Internationalis, a confederation of 162 Catholic relief agencies which operate in more than 200 nations and territories. The effect of these funding cuts has been staggering for both small and larger charities, such as Catholic Relief Services, the foreign aid program of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops founded in 1943. Carolyn Wu, who ran CRS from 2012 to 2016 and once served as Dean of the Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame, offers a chilling assessment. The freeze on foreign aid, she told our Sunday visitor, where it affects programs like this, really puts people's health, livelihood on the line, and it could actually cause death. That's because every year CRS provides aid to about 210 million people across 120 nations. And as Wu writes in a February 7th piece in America Magazine, more than half of its budget has come from USAID contracts. Half. Cut a charity's budget in half and you have the amount of help it can provide. Maybe you should not have been relying on the federal government, the same federal government that promotes diabolically evil programs internationally. What sort of help does CRS offer? Back to Wu, quote, USAID grants enable CRS to undertake emergency assistance and long-term transformational development. The work covers and integrates multiple areas for human flourishing: food, health, livelihoods, agriculture, education, water and sanitation, child development, access to capital, and peace building. As an aside, y'all should take a look at Lepanto Institute to tell you what CRS and other organizations like them actually do. In addition to that, they promote the James Martin sin internationally. They promote a lot of evil things internationally, probably as part of their grant funding. This complex work is not simply a handout, but a hand up. Wu recalls the story of Ernesto, a farmer who found himself destitute after years of costs outstripping returns on crop sales. With the help of CRS, the farmer learned to farm a new crop sustainably, and with that first return, he was able to set himself on the path to financial stability. Soon he began teaching other farmers these methods, and even saved enough to send his children to college. This program was funded by a grant from USAID, and I would 100% support the U.S. bishops funding that directly with with your tithing dollars that you choose voluntarily to give. There's nothing wrong with the Catholic Church helping people do this. The problem comes in when you start using federal money, which always comes with diabolical strings attached. Some claim that hobbling USAID was necessary because it is wasteful. Wu addresses that too, explaining that over the past 3 decades, global poverty has dropped from 1/3 of the population to 1/10, made possible by international development aid. What's more, Wu notes, quote, both maternal and infant child mortality rates have dropped by 50%. For anyone who prioritizes life issues, it's hard to imagine a better return on investment, considering that USAID counts for less than 1% of the federal budget. By the way, that's a new Democrat talking point, that they so desperately want to get this, what looks like a way of quietly moving money around to their pet projects, including electoral projects, that they want this restored. They're spending so much time on this that it's definitely a red flag. That they're talking about is it's only 1% of the federal budget. What's the big deal? But when you're $2 trillion and $2 trillion annual deficit, that's a big deal. But for the humanitarian crisis occasioned by these unsparing cuts is also a crisis of trust. Trust in the United States of America, in its ability to keep its word and honor its promises. Such a loss of trust could have dire consequences. This was immediately highlighted by Cardinal Christoph Schonborn, Archbishop Emeritus of Vienna. In a recent column referring to the cancellation of contracts, the Cardinal writes, what is currently happening in the United States of America is dangerous. Contracts govern large parts of our lives, the Cardinal continues. The rule of law thrives on the fact that treaties apply. When agreements are broken, the powerful dictate their will no matter what is contractually agreed. Loyalty and faith, trust and security, and above all, the weaker, poor, and defenseless are falling by the wayside, Cardinal Schonborn goes on, asking a simple but searing question. Do we want that? That was an aside. If you did not watch that video of mine, I did a video called Moderate Cardinal Morphs into Left-Wing Politician, and it's about Cardinal Schonborn's statement. I recommend you check that video out. The Vatican is getting involved in this. This is why I have said, if we have a conclave this year, and that might happen, famously, while it looks like Francis is is now on the mend, is starting to improve, rather famously, men of his age, with the condition he has, will have days of improvement before having some drastic bad days where things suddenly turn around in the wrong way. And looming over that, if we get a conclave, will be this USAID issue, without question. You've had good bishops, people we thought were on the side of reason and Catholicism and this great crisis in the church, come out on the side of the Vatican and on the side of Cupich on this USAID issue. This will be a determinant factor, or at least one of many, at that conclave. How will the next Holy Father handle this? What will his relationship to the American Empire be? And all the rest. That will be part of one of the issues of the conclave if we have one in the next few months. The we of it matters for any nation. Foreign aid is an expression of strategic wisdom. A world with less human suffering is by definition a safer world. A world in which nations keep their agreements is one in which development has a better chance of success. The path to improving the human condition leads not inward, but rather out from ourselves, from our enclaves and nations, towards lasting international partnership and the authentic flourishing of the human family. Finally, foreign humanitarian aid is also more deeply an expression of a nation's values. American values still include caring for the less fortunate, standing up for the oppressed, and building long-term peace through solidarity. The United States expressed American values when it helped Europe rebuild after the devastation of World War II. This is our legacy as a nation, and is one we must never abandon. As Christians, we follow the Lord's call to love our neighbor as ourselves, even when it's hard. But there's a less spiritual calculus to consider, namely, that weakening the social safety net at home or abroad will eventually affect us all, as none of us is invulnerable to disease or misfortune, no matter how blessed with health or wealth. America will be wise not to overreach the extent of her power in a connected world. After all, we never know when we'll need the help of a good Samaritan. There is usually a response that you see from people on this. Other countries rarely help the United States when there's a major crisis of some kind here. They rarely do. Sometimes you'll see like private figures do essentially collections to help, people in a hurricane or something. But if something drastically, horrifyingly bad happened on a large scale in the United States, there will probably be no help coming up from outside. So don't give me this Good Samaritan stuff. We all kind of know that doesn't hold water. Cardinal Cupich doesn't also understand one thing: the national debt and how it works. At present, we are at $36 trillion in national debt, and we'll probably hit 37 this year, unless there is a massively unforeseen thing that happens, which would be a balancing of the federal budget, which I don't see happening, not this year anyway. The law requires, federal law requires, as to our grant agreement or our loan agreements from mostly the Federal Reserve, most of the money we owe is to the Federal Reserve, a handful of families who run the Federal Reserve. And the way the law works is that the U.S. government will pay the interest payment as it accrues. That the debt number you see is really just the debt that we owe. When the interest payments accrue, we take and pay the entire interest all the time. So it doesn't build and build the way it does on a credit card for most people. The interest payments on the debt are growing to the point where it's now dwarfed the spending the U.S. government does on national defense. It is, in fact, now like the second or largest line item in the national budget. At some point, you keep accruing the debt, and it's going to hit the point where literally all the U.S. government does is borrow money and pay on the interest. The number one thing that destroys empires historically is typically debt accumulation, because it leads the government to do to make some really terrible decisions, or sometimes leads to just collapse. We can't keep doing this until we get our fiscal house in order. The national debt is an existential threat to the United States, at least as we know it. Cardinal Cupich doesn't seem to understand that. And unfortunately, the U.S. bishops don't seem to either. They have this document called Religious Liberty, Migration, and the Border. Yes, they believe that they are entitled to tax dollars as a matter of religious liberty to then undermine social cohesion and stability. They spend a lot of time in this document showing examples of how they do all this allegedly good work and how it's a religious precept for them to do it, which to a degree is true. Jesus commanded us to help the poor, to help those we encounter who need our help. The church has always said we must help migrants, always. It's also put a lot of caveats on that too. You can see them in the catechism. Virtually any Catholic YouTuber who's talked about this, or blogger, or whatever your preferred way of consuming content like this, has spoken about, if they have any credibility at all, has spoken about what the catechism has taught or what popes have taught on this in the past. And they spend a lot of time on all that, but I'm going to show you, there are two really egregious parts here, and I want to just show you this last part here. Under the heading of government funding opportunities, here's what the bishops have to say. Quote, for decades, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Department of Migration and Refugee Services, yes, the USCCB has a department for this, has carried out the commitment of the U.S. bishops to serve and advocate for refugees, asylees, and other forced migrants, immigrants, and other people on the move. Special concern is given to the most vulnerable among those populations, such as the victims of illicit moving of human beings. It's a phrase you can't use on this platform for some reason. This commitment is rooted in the gospel mandate that every person is to be welcomed as Christ himself, and the right of every human being to pursue the call to holiness. MRS has developed years of expertise in actively working to end this the most evil form of moving people about and protect those who have been exploited through it. In 2006, MRS's anti-program for this began administering a federal program to provide intensive case management to foreign national victims of it in the U.S. and its territories. In 2010, through its network of subcontracted agencies, ATSP helped survivors of that evil problem from 64 countries, with the largest number of survivors being from India, Mexico, Thailand, the Philippines, and Haiti. Survivors had been illicitly moved on farms, in hotels and casinos, and private homes and spas and other industries for the purpose of forced labor and or for the most horrifying way of using people for sins of the flesh. In 2011, the federal government changed its funding specifications to require them to provide or refer for contraceptive and Molochian services in violation of Catholic teaching. Consequently, the government refused to award funds to them, despite that MRS is earning a far higher objective score from the government's independent evaluators than two other organizations that were awarded the program. And those two scored so low that they were deemed unqualified. Meaning, look at how good we are. We defended the life issue here. We held to the Catholic teaching, a very unpopular thing, and we sacrificed the ability to get some money for it. I hope you're not eating when you hear this. Religious institutions should not be disqualified from government funding opportunities based on religious belief, and they do not lose religious freedom or identity upon receiving such funds. Yet a federal court in Massachusetts declared that the First Amendment requires such a disqualification, that the government violates religious liberty by allowing Catholic organizations to participate in programs in a manner consistent with their beliefs on contraception and the sacrifice to Moloch. Fortunately, in 2013, an appeals court vacated this terrible decision, but the possibility of similar suits in the future remains. In other words, this is a religious liberty issue. And I'm not the only one who noticed this, because there's another part in the document that points to this. You see it from Lepanto Institute sharing this on X. You can't really make this stuff up, says Michael Hitchborn. The USCCB is actually turning access to taxpayer money into a religious freedom issue. And are they just bent on proving J.D. Vance right in his assessment of their bottom line? From the Securing the Border section of this document, quote, the Secure the Border Act would restrict religious organizations from accessing federal funding. Specifically, the SBA has two provisions aimed at organizations serving newcomers. Section 115B of the bill presents a clear religious liberty issue. End quote. And then he gives a link to the actual document. And I'll have links to all of these in my show notes at returntotradition.org for your perusals, because it's so absurd. So absurd. And there have been some responses from people, a lot of laity saying this. I've seen it in my own comment section. I have seen it on YouTube. I have seen it on X. I've seen it on Facebook. And that is, more laity now are saying they were never going to give another dime to their parish. They're never going to give another dime to their bishop. They will pay their tithe by helping support Catholic operations that they know their money will be used for actually Catholic purposes. The bishops are bent on digging a deeper hole for themselves. There's been another response, a very rare response from good bishops. And this is from a bishop that I have covered from time to time on this channel. He's an auxiliary bishop, Northern Europe, who is retired, Bishop Marian Eleganti. Marco Tossati published this on his website. The translation might leave a little something to be desired. But the title of his is A Country is Not Obligated to Accept All Migrants. The State Should Not Be Against Its Citizens, by Monsignor Marian Eleganti. This is really short. This is a bishop who understands. Remember, this is not just an issue in America. Before, it was an issue in America to the degree that it is now, because Americans have been very unhappy with this issue for decades. But the last few years, it's gotten really bad. But before all that, it was like the biggest issue in Europe. It still probably is. Here's what the bishop has to say. The state has the duty to protect its borders and protect its population from any harm. Immigration should be legal and controlled to maintain social peace within the country, prevent cross-border crime, and ensure that migrants are integrated into the population and the labor market in an orderly manner. Common sense from a bishop. How dare he? Love for foreigners and neighbors, hospitality, cultural openness are postulates of moral ethics that concern individual conscience. The state cannot structurally produce good in the minds of its citizens. The citizen must link his conscience to truth and justice or to God. This also applies to politicians. It is not the task of the state to establish a dictatorship of opinions through propaganda and censorship, which serve the political goals of those currently in power. The liberal state must protect and guarantee the freedom of assembly and freedom of expression of its citizens. It must not weaken itself with sanctions that supposedly aim to counteract its own delegitimization through the free expression of citizens. The task of the state is to guarantee peace in the country through fair conditions, protected from the monopoly of violence, for example, property, the right to demonstrate, and freedom of assembly. The master of the country is not the state, but the citizens, who in a democracy elect politicians and grant or revoke their mandate. Politicians must be able to be ousted and criticized if they do not fulfill their mandate. This is democracy. It would be naive to believe that peace in the country can be maintained through do-goodism, using moral arguments in politics. Justice as a balance of interests is a matter for the state. In politics, compromise is fundamental. This is an ethical responsibility. Often there is no choice but to choose the lesser of two latent evils. Politicians must act with ethical responsibility, i.e., weigh the consequences. They must not act as thought police. Freedom of expression and an independent competitive media without standardization of thought and without pre-established quarters of opinion, see reports during the 2020 affliction and on the war in Eastern Europe, are a prerequisite for democracy. Citizens must be able to freely form their own opinions and express them peacefully at every opportunity. The state must create the framework conditions for free competition of ideas. Religion is not the servant of the state. It must ensure that God has what belongs to God and that the state has what belongs to it. Where the state, its laws, and its monopoly of power create injustice, the citizens must obey God rather than the state and refuse to obey the state. What is decisive is the connection of each individual's conscience with God, with truth, and with justice. We are increasingly wondering where this connection between politics and journalism has gone. Interests have always been the greatest enemies of truth. Opportunists ignore their own conscience. The right of religion to exist within a state structure does not derive from its usefulness to the state. It must not curry favor with the state by trying to convince it of its usefulness. Religion and faith play in a league different from politics. They're not on the same level. It is enough that the conscience of the citizens is linked to God and therefore acts morally. The domain of religion is conscience. The task of the state is the just order and well being of the citizens. The action of the state must prove fair. A country is not obliged to accept all migrants. Careful consideration must be given to the inability to integrate due to objective obstacles or a reluctance to integrate motivated by cultural or religious reasons, meaning parallel societies, as well as the limits of financing the integration process of the years through training, securing a livelihood through one's own efforts, work, etc. It is not a question of attitudes, but of numbers. Problems must remain solvable. Cries like, "We can do it," do not help. A comparison. Every responsible parent will think twice before deciding whether to adopt a foreign child, integrate him into his family, and ensure his development and education. His resources to help him are limited. Considerations of responsibility and ethics in this regard become more urgent with each additional child. Anything else would be irresponsible despite good intentions. The same applies, mutatis mutandis, to migration. Responsibility in the context of migration, necessary, possibly restrictive measures such as border controls, regulation of expenditure in this area has nothing to do with xenophobia. The problems with immigration solves that it, or the problems that immigration solves and those it poses must remain in balance. The fact that this is so difficult to understand is striking in the current debate. The accusation hits people inside the church even harder because the church has never taught anything else. Human dignity is inviolable, of course, but it is no more infinite or limited than human rights. In the case of migration, the needs are limited not least by the resources of the host country. The state must ensure stable and orderly conditions. If the state is no longer able to ensure these due to uncontrolled immigration, crime, unaffordable social benefits, overcrowded municipalities, overloaded infrastructure, etc., it must take measures to limit immigration and the problems associated with it. This should be obvious to everyone. The reason why he doesn't do it, Caesar meaning, or why he lacks the necessary measures, has other reasons besides lack of intuition. And that is the words of Bishop Marian Eleganti in response to most of it seems like the Western bishops who've lost their minds on this issue. That is so rare to hear from bishops. I think Archbishop Naumann was the only other one to say this. The rest have given these kind of, yeah, the government has a right to manage the situation, but you need to give us the money to help keep this evil thing going. All right, folks. Curious what you have to say about this. Let me know in the comments, please. And I'm going to check the live chat once before we go. Colleen says, I find myself having to defend my church all the time with my Protestant friends. I can't defend the indefensible. It does not help others want to join the church when they blatantly violate laws. Right. But they don't care. The bishops don't seem to care about that. The Vatican doesn't. How many times for the last 40 years have we heard one pope after another say, well, becoming Catholic is basically the privileged way. You're good enough where you are. Becoming Christian isn't even that big of a deal as long as you're following your conscience and being a pious person. It goes back to Vatican II. That's an issue that the church as an institution didn't have before then. John Plick says, America is not the panacea for the world, only Jesus Christ. Absolutely. 100%. 100%. That's why these kinds of things, helping the poor, should be done primarily by the church through the money given to it from members of the church. I hadn't heard of Mexico sending help for the LA for the going on in LA. The Canadian help I heard was of a small token. Yeah, I think Mexico did send some firefighters. It does happen, but it's not exactly like what the U.S. does, even on a relative scale that another country could do. David Keller says there are very few really Catholic orgs left. Even St. Vincent de Paul has been infiltrated. Yes. All right, folks. Says Anthony, U.S. government debt is $37 trillion officially. Okay, so I guess it must have crossed over when I didn't realize it. The real figure, if you count the massive losses at the FDIC and the U.S. Treasury and the U.S. Federal Reserve System, is likely to be about 45. And if you count unfunded the unfunded programs, that these are social programs that the government can't easily get rid of, entitlement programs, then you're looking at much higher than that. All right, folks. Anthony Stine for president 2028. No, thank you. No, thank you. There are much better people for this than me. Anyway, folks, let me know if you're watching this later what you think about all this in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Share this on social media helps too. If you ever thought about supporting the work we do here at Return to Tradition, Patreon, subscribe star, our options below. There's also that join button. It does keep these messages coming daily. As always, pray for the church. Anthony Stine, Ave Maria.